Other than that, very similar books. So we're going to talk about Chapter 1, the role of the game designer today. And it gives an overview of the entire book. If this is the only chapter you read, or if you're only going to read one chapter, read this chapter. It's not especially meaty, but it's awfully, awfully important, and it has a lot of questions that will be on quizzes, tests, and other assignments you will do throughout this semester. Let's talk first about what game designers do not do. The game designer may not be a programmer. You may not do any programming at all if you're the game designer. You might not be an artist. You may not create what those fabulous characters or spaceships or monsters look like. You might not compose the music yourself. In fact, the game designer often does not, although a game designer might do any of these things. The game designer might not manage the budget of the game, depending on how big of a team you're dealing with. Though the game designer might do any or all of these, especially if you're a indie game developer, in which case you might do everything or contract out a few of these things, as we'll hear about later in the term. So what do you do if you are a game designer? Well, I hope this isn't too sad of a news break for you, but you're going to have to play some games if you're going to be a game designer. And your prime directive as you are going about your career designing games is you must be an advocate for your player. Remember this. This will be on the quiz this week. This will be on the midterm. This will be on the final exam. This is the most important thing a game designer does, is you are an advocate for the player. Whatever it takes to make the game more fun, that is your job. All right, as an advocate for the player, you're going to be focusing on what the player does, what the player feels, what the player sees, the emotions and interactions the player has with the game. You're going to give the player superior gameplay. It's your job to make your game play better than other games play. Also, as an advocate for the player, you should not get bogged down in the details. That's why they often separate that. Do not fall in love with things like the art and the music and the story and the characters, etc. And do not lose your objectivity. You must look at the game objectively. You must be able to look at the game as if you were a player who was coming at it from the outside, not intimately connected with it. Because if you do lose your objectivity, I will cite my favorite horrible example. The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, is the worst video game I have ever played. This is the version based on the Tolkien books. That was made for the PlayStation 2. This is not the version based on the movies that was actually pretty good. And if you want to see more bad games, you can go to YouTube and search for worst games ever. You will see many people saying terrible, terrible things about a lot of games. E.T. And E.T. is one of them on the list, yes. And many of the games that you will see cited there are based on popular movies, as the E.T. example we just heard about, The Wizard of Oz, Back to the Future, and Platoon. There was originally a really terrible Back to the Future game. Now there's a pretty good one out. So where did these games go wrong? Let's explore that a little bit, as they do in Chapter 1 of your textbook, by talking about what makes a good game. Yes, art, character, plot, and setting, things like that will be discussed by your game reviewers in gaming magazines and on websites and blogs. So they are important things. And we're going to study those things throughout the term. The question is, did they have good art, characters, plot, settings in Lord of the Rings, The Wizard of Oz, and Back to the Future, and Platoon? Well, that's a very easy question to answer. Of course they did. Those are beloved characters and plots and settings. So what went wrong? I believe that the game designer lost perspective in making these games. The game designer fell in love with characters like Doc Brown or Frodo Baggins, or put too much emphasis on settings like the Shire or the wonderful world of Oz. or even had too much glitzy stuff like the time travel or getting lost in the Vietnam jungle in the Platoon game. And I believe what went wrong is they didn't build in enough quality gameplay. So remember that. No matter how beautiful your game is, if the gameplay isn't good, players will make terrible YouTube videos about your game. So, where do you get quality gameplay? The first thing you need to do is play games. Be a game player yourself. Become a play tester if you can. Test other people's games while they're in a rough stage of development. And we're going to talk about play testing later in the term, and you'll find out what its uses are and how to do it. You should find your passions and stick with them. If you don't like rhythm games, you probably shouldn't work on rhythm games, for example. Develop your skills. Develop every skill you can. Programming skills, art skills, playing skills, communication skills especially. Let's talk about some of those important game developer skills. Communication. You've got to be able to communicate with your players, your fans, your team who's developing your game. Sensitivity. You need to understand what the player is experiencing to give them a good emotional experience. Teamwork, especially important if you're working with a team in developing your game. You've got to understand the game design process, which is laid out in the textbook. I'll refer you to read that. The game design process is an iterative repeating cycle according to Game Design Workshop. And yes, this will be quizzed and tested this term. There's a 4-step diagram in Game Design Workshop. You can see it on page 11 of the first edition, page 15 of the second edition. Let me turn to page 15 of the second edition. There is this loop shown on page 15 of the second edition. The generate ideas, formalize ideas, test ideas, and evaluate the results, and then repeat until game is good. Until done. All right. Then there are 7 steps that go into more detail outlined here of that are shown on these pages, page 11 to 16 of the first edition and 15 to 19 of the second or third edition. The steps are outlined here: brainstorming, and it talks about how to do that in the textbook. I am not going to read the textbook to you on television. You make a physical prototype of the game, a step that is often skipped, and we're going to talk about how to do that this semester and how important that is. You present your game idea, your game concept, your physical prototype to financial backers. You make a software prototype. We'll go over some excellent ways to make software prototypes in this class. Game Maker, that we're going to be working with this semester, can be a good way to make software prototypes. We won't probably do any assignments in Alice, but I'll make Alice available to you. That's a good way to make 3D software prototypes using a free language. And then you will make a design document for the game that will be followed by the entire game development team. And the game will go into production. You create the production game. And once the game is in production and going out to the world, you will have quality assurance. You will have your tech support line. You will have your ways of fixing bugs and detecting problems with the game and the ways players interact with it. And we're going to explore those things throughout this term. All right, and always, always be sure to keep your players in mind. They are the most important asset you have, the people who love your game and want to keep playing it. All right, coming up next time, we're going to discuss the structure of games. That will be the next chapter in this book that we cover. I have finished the lecture early today, so we're going to sign off for now. That's it this week for Intro to Computer Games and Simulations here at Lorain County Community College.